Hello, comrades! Today we have Roman Kovalenko in the studio with us. Hello, Roma!
Hello.
And since Roma is with us, it means that today we're discussing the specifics of airplane physics, including how they fly, their systems, and so on. And as you may have seen from the title of the video, today we'll discuss more about how we figure out how they fly. Right, we will have accordingly four main sections in our conversation today. Let's start with the very first one. What are the general flight technical characteristics? What are they and what is specific about them for airplanes?
What do we even mean by flight technical or flight tactical characteristics, as they are sometimes called? I will speak in such simple and general terms. In general, they can be divided into four groups. First is what is usually understood by them. These are familiar characteristics such as speed, rate of climb, and turn time. In other words, how the aircraft flies directly. Yes, here we are excluding characteristics like size and weight, which are not relevant right now. We are specifically talking about flight characteristics. So we can directly measure the first group of characteristics. This includes things like takeoff time, landing distance, and the height of obstacle clearance after takeoff. Generally, everything is more or less clear. The next group is a bit more interesting. It's quite a challenging thing to measure directly, stability and controllability. In principle, there are clear criteria for stability and controllability, such as balancing, stability reserve, and damping time. However, these are more nuanced aspects that are not as readily apparent. They can be felt, but measuring them directly, especially without special tools and methods, is more difficult. Various types of transient processes can also be included here, such as how, for example, an airplane reacts to a control stick input or pedal input, and how its trajectory then changes.
Let's immediately reveal a little bit our cards and the specifics of the terms that we use. What is pedal input?
Pressing the pedal occurs when the pilotician pushes the pedal to a certain extent. For example, follower fully holds it for a certain time, such as a second, and then releases it. The aircraft receives an impulse from the pedal and then reacts to this control input in some way. Typically, it involves a slight oscillatory movement or straight skidding.
Well, you can do this with the cars. Yes, if you don't mind risking your health by jerking the steering wheel and seeing how it behaves. But it's better to do this with a pro on a racetrack.
Do not try this at home.
Yes.
By combining these two data sets in a specific manner, we can then derive an empirical factor such as the pilot's impression of the aircraft, for instance. Actually, this can also be quantitatively assessed. There is even a Cooper-Harper scale, I believe, which measures how a pilot rates the aircraft in terms of its stability and controllability. Yet many recall a certain aircraft and describe it with terms such as sharp, pleasant, or calm. This is also an important thing. It cannot be directly adjusted, but it is very important. For example, everyone knows that the Yak-9 is a very stable and controllable aircraft. In one of the reports on the Yak-9, it was stated that it is the benchmark of a stable aircraft according to the Yak-9. This was the evaluation of a test pilot. In principle, regarding some of our aircraft that will be flyable, a certain impression has formed after studying sources that, for example, the F-80 will be quite strict in control, but at the same time...
A shooting star, right?
Shooting star, yes, strict, but maneuverable and responsive. I could probably describe it as the jet equivalent of an I-16. There was a very famous American training aircraft based on it. I read an opinion that if you learn to fly on the F-80 or T-33, then you know how to fly.
There is also an analogy here, by the way, from the automotive world. Drivers like to describe the car they drive, right? Like a good grip, or maybe it rolls, let's say. So these are characteristics on the level of sensations, which are conveyed quite figuratively. However, if you are, for example, going to create a car simulator, then you'll have to formalize this process somehow. It's the same here.
Yes, well, I can share a little more. For example, the F-84 is usually described as a very stable weapons platform, an airplane from which it is enjoyable to shoot and it holds a steady combat course, things like that. As for the Sabre, for example, I came across an interesting report featuring mock air battles between the F-84 and the Sabre, and pilots even switched planes. The same pilot would first fly the F-84, then the Sabre, and vice versa. Interestingly, the F-84's stability was confirmed, and
Thunderjet.
Thunderjet, yes. On the F-86, there were issues with catching in the sights and holding the aim on the F-84. So the Sabre has a very sensitive nature and is also somewhat unstable.
So it's a bit like that. You're trying to aim the crosshairs at the target precisely, and it wobbles a bit, right, so to speak. You have to catch it.
Yes, we will see how we can later reproduce this nuance. Or for instance, the Il-10. Many compared the Il-10 with fighters, for example, in terms of maneuverability. In general, a crucial point is how the aircraft will feel. The last group of characteristics is even more indirect, but nonetheless, it is something that can be measured and evaluated, these aerodynamic characteristics. These are the wind tunnel tests of the aircraft, specifically the lift-to-drag ratio curve. This is extremely important and necessary. And this, again, affects all its subsequent characteristics. Sometimes this is forgotten, but it's like this.
No, well, the aerodynamic characteristics are essentially the foundation. Everything else stems from them.
Yes, however, when a plane is described, they usually say, I've generally been talking in descending order. They typically say that the plane has a maximum speed, maximum rate of climb, and turn time characteristics. About the next group, which I divided in this way, is less commonly heard but also important. It's more like a set of data. Sometimes they discuss aerodynamics, and then you achieve maximum efficiency. Well, we have defined the characteristics. The next point is where to look for them.
Yes, the problems of sources and finding, analyzing, and comparing them. In history, there is an entire science dedicated to this, a branch of history called source studies.
Yes, and we have encountered this sort of thing fully during our research, right?
It would seem that we have found a report that states, for example, the maximum speed of the airplane, and we could be happy. We have the report, and actually, why not use it right away?
Let's go do it right away.
Let's get to work. Oh, no, because there are several problems with the sources. First of all, each one production aircraft has been tested. It doesn't mean all aircraft will be the same, especially if a prototype was used for testing. Because if you ask any pilot, they will tell you that there are no two identical planes. There's always, say, a squadron of some fighters, for example, and all the planes are slightly different. One might not fly very well, while another is preferred to fly. There are always some aircraft that are used less often because it's simply impossible to maintain perfect precision during construction. All planes are slightly different.
Especially since we know, I believe this stage is called state trials, when the prototype is tested, right? In my opinion, these are state trials, right? During state trials, the prototype is usually fully prepared. They smooth everything that can be smoothed, specifically the aircraft's airframe and gaps, and all gaps are thoroughly sealed. All rivets are aligned, polished, and painted as perfectly as possible, which is also important because the quality of the aircraft's finish significantly affects drag. And they test it, and then the aircraft is adopted into service. After some time, for example, they schedule control tests at the front. It turns out that the aircraft, which was all polished, is one story, but in the Air Force, when it was mass-produced, it had already managed to fight and fly. And if you do not install the highest quality parts, for example, a completely different story can unfold.
In connection with this, I would like to recall two such stories. The first story is a report on the wind tunnel testing of a production La-5 aircraft. There was a great phrase, something along the lines of the wing of the mass-produced La-5 has an aerodynamic profile of arbitrary shape with unsatisfactory characteristics, something like that.
Arbitrary?
Yes, it is written something like that. I'll try maybe to find that report later too.
This is probably related to the skin layer detaching problem with this model, right?
Perhaps there's, I think, a comparison. There's a blueprint, a theoretical profile, and, well, practically arbitrary, of course. The authors probably got carried away, apparently wrote it in the heat of the moment, but you can see that over...
So they tried to replace the swearing with general words, right?
But it's definitely clear that there were some problems with it. Yeah. Yes.
With the layers on the skin, there was a problem. The plane had spent just a few months at the front, and problems began.
Right, and we also have a report on control tests of serial aircraft from 1943 to 44, if memory serves. And there, each month, one serial aircraft was tested. And there, the speed variation for aircraft of one type, let's say the LA-5F, was plus or minus 10 kilometers per hour.
Here we are immediately asked the question, so here's your perfect prototype, and then you have, let's say, a completely crooked, twisted, battle-weary, like how to choose censored words for it. In short, an uneven plane. And how do you choose which one to implement in the game?
Well, for me personally, the ideal data are still from the production aircraft, because they were in battle. Prototypes are all great, yes, but there are some nuances to consider.
And so what do we usually end up choosing?
Zero.
Series production, but functional.
Yes. So completely wrecked is not good at all.
Well, it's clear that in some cases, such as the report on the LA5, with a margin of plus or minus 10 kilometers per hour, we aim to maintain this margin.
Yes, and there are examples, by the way, in the opposite direction. Tests, for instance, of captured German planes.
Yes.
Though during tests, a plane would be used that was obviously completely wrecked. Its supercharger wasn't working, right? And it would fly very poorly. But in reality, this plane was simply defective.
Yes, once when I was working on the P-38, there was also a set of reports on various tests, and I focused on one of the reports. And it seemed like I nailed it, but something was off. It didn't line up with the others. I started looking closely again and read the fine print. The fine print stated that one of the engines of this aircraft was faulty, so such nuances also occur. So, the next point. So, alright, they tested some airplanes and got some data. However, it's essential to recognize that tests are never perfect. There are methodological errors, let's call them that. As a vivid example, there was a report on the maneuverability of the Yak-9, in which the turn time of the Yak-9 was measured at 26 seconds or even 27 seconds, a quite large range. But it's clear that a more familiar number for the Yak-9 and more accurate is closer to 20 seconds, not 26, and it was written there like hooray, hooray. We tested a new measurement method. So before, roughly speaking, a pilot sat in the cockpit with a stopwatch. Well, now we place markers and measure everything from the ground. Now we have the exact correct result they wrote. This is an example of methodological errors. Because how to get precise numbers from the fact that the plane somehow performs maneuvers, that is the problem. The same climb rates are measured not by the plane taking off straight from the ground.
This was especially a problem back then because there were no flight recorders.
Well, they were there, but all sorts of speedographs. Well,
yes, so right now you have something like a black box, basically even a standard one from which you can see practically everything. You have speed, course, roll, pitch, angles of attack recorded more or less in real time, everything you need. You can accurately set the boundaries of maneuvers using these parameters and understand the time required to execute them. Well, just like telemetry in races, for example, the same thing. But back then, none of that was there, or it was very, very simplified, right?
Or how was speed determined? There was a measured base distance.
Yes.
And this was simply passed several times in different directions to eliminate the influence of the wind.
Could the wind have changed?
The wind could have changed, yes. People with stopwatches stood there, taking time marks as accurately as they could. Then, as far as I know, they started using photo finishes with automation. Moreover, it was not only serial aircraft that were measured this way, but also, in general, back in the 1930s, this was the era of setting speed records, which is how speeds were approximately measured.
Will photo finish significantly help us when measuring speed at an altitude of like 6 kilometers?
Not really. So, in general, there are also errors in the methodology here. But, all right, methodologies are methodologies, but we also have non-ideal instruments. Here, because the same onboard instruments are used, they operate with an error. The most well-known error is that of the speed indicator, which is usually specified in the aircraft manual, at what speed and with what error the instrument operates, because speed is measured using an air pressure receiver, which, as a technical system, has its own distortions until the air, so to speak, reaches through the entire pathway from the pitot tube.
Air pressure receiver?
Yes, by the time the air reaches the device's box, it's clear that there will be distortions. Depending on the angle of attack at which this receiver is positioned in the airstream, it will slightly distort the incoming pressure. Therefore, precise measurement can be a problem.
And then just a tube, a simple tube that goes, and there's an air pressure receiver, a little tube. Somewhere this little tube got bent inconveniently, it got a fracture or something else happened to it.
Well, yes, there's the installation on a specific aircraft and in principle as a technical system. Therefore, there are correction charts. And finally, like something often overlooked is the conversion of tests to a standard atmosphere. As the tests can be conducted in either winter or summer, in heat or cold. And depending on the temperature, the aircraft's characteristics change because the air density is different. This affects engine power, and since the air density varies with temperature, the engine power also changes accordingly, resulting in a denser or thinner atmosphere. Aerodynamics work slightly differently as they depend on dynamic pressure, which in turn depends on density. Therefore, all the obtained results must be recalculated to standard atmospheric conditions using specific methods, which assume a temperature of 15 degrees on the ground and a pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury. And here, too, there can be errors, inaccuracies. That is, it seems like we have a report, and everything should be fine, but we must keep in mind all these 4 points. Without them, you get some slightly abstract characteristics, and this often happens when we have several reports, which, although they don't necessarily contradict each other, do have nuances. For example, on the same Mustang, if I remember correctly, there were about 7 sources in the end at the same time.
7?
In my opinion, 7. But it was interesting. We have the Mustang with 2 engines, and part of the sources were for the aircraft with the old engine and part for the aircraft with the new engine. There were also prototypes and production models, as well as modified prototypes featuring new engines on an old airframe, quite a mixed assortment. Essentially, they are consistent with each other, but there are subtle differences. And yes, it's also worth noting that some of the aircraft had bomb racks, while others did not. So with this, we tried to match these sources collectively, all of them. It was a very interesting process.
Yes, regarding the adjustment to standard atmosphere, there's a point to be made, right? If we measure the characteristics of the airplane on the ground, that's one story. We can at least directly measure the wind. And thus, if we capture all these characteristics at a high altitude, well, let's say 5 kilometers and above, and sometimes up to 10, there weren't really any special means for the rapid measurement of atmospheric parameters, since for each measurement you either need to launch a weather reconnaissance or a balloon. Yes, accordingly. At the same time, it's essential to recognize that, yes, all these issues are indeed solved with statistics. You can simply make, say, 100 flights, and then you'll have a huge sample, and you just through the work of such a science as statistics, you can construct an average characteristic which will be reliable. However, if we examine a real test report, there are far from an infinite number of flights. Sometimes there are just 2, and that's it. So it turns out there isn't really a sample. So yes, this really is a problem.
Yes, but I will also probably share an interesting and an important point here and tell a story. There are also problems with aerodynamics, because if we have a wind tunnel test for the plane, it can't be used directly for that purpose, because there are various complex similarity criteria, various Reynolds numbers.
Yes, I remember hearing that terrifying word, Reynolds number.
Because the model is either very small,
Yes.
And because there is such a thing as the Reynolds number, it determines how, so to speak, air molecules interact with the size of the surface. Therefore, if the model is just small, it should have corrections for size. If the model is full scale, but the test is conducted at low speed, there should also be corrections. Additionally, the wind tunnels themselves also introduce distortions.
Yes, they do not have a laminar flow inside.
We had a story about the Focke-Wulf 190, which was released in the distant past. In what year?
For us, it has been since 2014.
We revised it several times because it was initially created based on the available data. Overall, everything was great. Then we came across wind tunnel data. I still remember the Chalais-Meudon wind tunnel or something like that.
Yes. That's a famous story, yeah.
Right. We worked like, great, aerodynamics. Now we'll fixed it. And then some nonsense starts. Clearly something has become strange. It then turned out that the tunnel in Chalais-Meudon was of the open or semi-open type. In general, there were quite significant distortions. That's when we probably realized for the first time, through bitter experience, that you have to be careful with aerodynamics. Then later, we revised the Focke-Wulf.
Well, back then, it was excusable for us because we had just finished dealing with the First World War, and in the First World War, there were no wind tunnel tests at all, right? And when we moved to the Second World War, these specifics, well, we just didn't know them yet. Now, with bitter experience, we are aware of all this, and our knowledge base enables us to make the appropriate sampling. Now, let's move on. To a similar topic, specifically how we measure flight performance in our simulator within the virtual world.
Actually, it's quite simple. Now we have special modes of operation for our engine helper to measure maximum speeds. Basically, it's a slightly modified version, like a horizontal flight, a slightly modified version of it, which simply maintains maximum speed horizontally, and we wait until the aircraft stops accelerating. So there's a slight nuance. Our speed turns out to be ideal. That is, in real life, a pilot cannot maintain the aircraft as evenly as we can in our simulator.
And for so long.
And in such a perfect ideal atmosphere. Therefore, our derived results are often slightly of an ideal nature. The next point is the rate of climb, also a variation of the altitude hold system, but instead of altitude, it maintains vertical speed. We immediately set the climb profile from the ground to the ceiling, at what speeds we gain altitude, and that's how we see how much time passes. The nuance is that, in reality, the rate of climb is usually obtained by the step method. There, they perform such climbs at certain altitudes and do it according to a set of data. Ultimately, they acquire data points, and then these points are approximated by a single large curve. We measure this directly, so our results here are also somewhat idealized.
But nevertheless, knowing this, we make specific adjustments.
Of course, yes.
That is, you do not need to think that if we have an idealized result, for example, slightly better than in the tests, we forget the fact that our methodology differs somewhat. No, such an adjustment, of course, is made.
Right, so the next nuance involves various aspects, no? Such as turns, takeoffs, and landings, where for the most part everything is done manually. We also have modes for using artificial intelligence to perform the perfect turn, but often we still do it by hand. We have a special timer that allows us to mark the time precisely, measuring the exact duration of the turn. And usually by repeating the turn many times in a specific mode, we get our own time. Takeoff, landing, the same thing manually. Usually we try to check the length of the takeoff and rollout. It's essential to check the length of the takeoff because it also provides an indirect assessment of the initial engine thrust.
Because while the plane is taking off, it is mainly affected by the engine thrust, which is significantly greater than the resistance.
It's a decent check manually because you need to understand that you can lift the plane off the ground before the takeoff distance and it will take off. However, this does not align with how to fly it correctly. It does not match the flight manual. Therefore, you need to understand what you are doing here thoroughly. That's why all our engineers need to know somehow how to fly, even if virtually and consciously perform possible actions. That is to check the piloting, perform basic maneuvers exactly as in the manual.
That's why there's this little nuance.
Yes, and by the way, that's why each engineer working with us needs to be provided with a proper set of control devices, including pedals, throttles, high-resolution joystick with standard mechanics that don't stick, that sort of thing. By the way, speaking of vertical speed, if I remember correctly, in real life it is not measured directly because the vertical speed indicator is one of the most inaccurate instruments.
Yes. They're according to time.
Yes, there they stop the stopwatch at altitude. That's how.
Yes, there are indeed methods.
Yes, because the vertical speed indicator is probably the most inaccurate instrument in the aircraft, right?
By the way, speaking of which, if my memory serves me correctly, a flight testing manual states that errors in climb tests can reach approximately 10%. It was published during the Second World War.
Wow. This is considering that we tried to hit within a 2% error range.
Earlier it was 5. Now we're trying to get closer to 2.
Yes, so it turns out that the accuracy of our flight model adjustment is higher than in the test trials.
Yes, that's an amusing nuance for sure.
Listen, do we use a method like comparing with real videos of takeoffs, landings, maneuvers?
Yes, we use them. What's interesting here is that we sometimes use them, such as video recordings, especially if they are from the cockpit. These are very useful tools. And occasionally a small part of the black box recordings comes up. For example, we came across flight recorder records of the Yak-9 in our state archive where they conducted mock dogfights. And then you can try to recreate some maneuvers in the simulator and compare them with real-life data. Right now we have some materials on the Sabre. We are currently using the flight recordings of the Sabre in the same way. And we made a comparison of the results. It turns out to be interesting.
Although video recordings have their peculiarities too. For example, we don't exactly know the frame rate. Sometimes it has to be adjusted using certain, let's say, specific settings, such as when there is something in the frame, like a clock with second hands. We will use them to adjust the video frame rate, because it is quite common that the so-called footage, yes, that is this video with flights, airplanes during the Second World War, or there, 1950s, that it might be slightly sped up or slowed down, and you can't really tell, you won't know if you don't specifically research the matter.
By the way, I also recall modern recordings from air shows. On some airplanes, they evaluated at least the minimum roll rate because normal data for roll rate isn't always available. On the frame, a piece of the instrument panel was visible, showing the indicated speed. From there, you could estimate that the stick was approximately probably to the side, so the speed was no less than...
Once upon a time, when I worked at Eagle Dynamics, it was during a period when obtaining source data for modern aircraft was particularly difficult. It was essentially the primary method for obtaining data on maneuverability. All right, let's move on. So, what exactly is the complexity and essence of setting up a flight model and takeoff characteristics in an aircraft's flight model?
The complexity lies in the fact that we cannot simply input the maximum speed directly into a magical table. Our aircraft is a combination of several models isolated from each other. There are the inertial mass model, the aerodynamic model, and a separate, very complex model of the engine and propeller. By the way, the engine and propeller are two separate models, for example.
And they all naturally work in coordination.
To achieve the same speed, we need to have exemplary aerodynamics with the correct drag, the right mass, and proper control, because the balance attack angle depends to some extent on mass, and control affects the costs associated with balancing.
Adhesive, the losses required to maintain the plane's stability on the horizon, as it will experience different stabilities, elevator deflections, balancing losses, and maximum speeds. Correct engine thrust is needed. I just mentioned one parameter, maximum speed, where everything, so to speak, immediately has an impact, and therefore the challenge is to ensure that all models are, on the one hand, adequate, and on the other hand, produce accurate results. And it's precisely this complex of everything that is the main essence of the setup. And this isn't easy.
And there's also the point that you need to consistently adhere to unified rules and approaches in setting the characteristics of all the aircraft you have in the game. Otherwise, if you apply one approach and criteria to evaluate one airplane and a different approach and criteria to another, you will end up with inconsistent aircraft characteristics.
Yes, at the same time, it is also important to understand that since models are not perfect, it is sometimes necessary to identify where they are imperfect and either introduce new approaches or understand how to utilize existing tools to simulate specific dynamic effects. This also means you need to know what you're doing here.
Yes, we had a similar story with those jet exhaust.
Yes, there was a situation where I can't remember which plane it was, but there was just a bit of speed missing, just a little bit of speed. And then, yes, we came across the idea that this little extra speed should come quite literally from the exhaust outlets. Not all aircraft exhausts are designed to provide noticeable thrust. But in this particular case, they did. And they added the calculation of this thrust, which also depends on the aircraft's speed. So it's not just adding 100 kilograms of thrust and that's it. No, it actually depended on the engine's operating mode due to the varying amount of exhaust gases and speed. Because the exit velocity, well, you get the idea. And that's when it worked. Now on the Sabre, there are interesting effects. I suspect it's somehow related to the shadowing of the tail by the wing, because when adjusting the balance, it didn't quite match the chart. We added consideration at certain angles of attack where the stabilizer is likely to enter the wing's shadow.
It became significantly closer. Perhaps that was the right guess.
Just recently, literally a few days ago, I would say, I watched a new episode on Tactic Media about the history of the La-5 with, I believe, Gennady Serov, right?
Yes, I think so.
Gennady Serov, yes, one of my favorite speakers. So the funny thing was that, for example, on the La-5, with one of those exhaust manifold configurations they had there, the jet effect only occurred when the side flaps of the hood were closed, and only then did it start to do something. But still, well, I mean, this is how it's written in the reports, but there's no evidence provided there. And so the question remains, yes, I mean, it's written in the report, but is it actually so? So it would need to be researched, yes, right? Because in principle, well, it sounds a bit strange, considering that the exhaust outlet profile does not really look to be suitable, right? But nevertheless, take note of that, yes.
Well, sometimes it turns out that such guesses, when it seems like something is missing, actually reveal that the guess was correct. And yes, indeed, it fits. It has become better.
Maybe they put it faster for a simpler reason. They do not measure the thrust directly from these nozzles. They just look at the speed. Maybe it's just flying faster because the turbulence of the flows on these flaps has decreased and the fuselage's streamlining has improved, right? And that's why it flies faster. Maybe that's just why, right? And who conducted the test sort of, well, made an assumption about it. Well, that's how we all live with it. Here's a question. We had a similar situation with the Tempest, right? When there's a report, but it's configured to the model and doesn't match, that's it.
Yes, we had such a case. We trusted the report. It specified the stall speeds quite clearly. And I think, if I'm not mixing this up with the P47, the maximum psi value was also specified somewhere. And in general, it seemed that something was too good. Well, the speed is specified. It flies. There's the document. We believed it. Well, actually, a year ago, finally, our Tempest got an update, where that magical quality finally disappeared. On one hand, it was understood that these were inaccuracies in the speed indicator. This was discovered later when we were working on the Typhoon.
In the speed indicator of the tested aircraft?
Yes, precisely there. And in the Typhoon, we have found corrections to the speed indicator and took that into account on the one hand. On the other hand, we thank our players very much for visiting the archive and sharing the data with us. They found additional data on its aerodynamics. And so that's when it all came together. So there are cases where you trust a report, but something strange is found in it. Yes, these do happen. There was also a humorous case when we were tuning the Messerschmitt 262. A Soviet report was conducted on testing the aircraft's balance at various Mach numbers, which was used to adjust its controllability. Then it turned out that the servo compensators were locked.
Excellent.
Here on the tested Soviet aircraft. And so it was necessary to make some slight adjustments. It's also a delicate matter of what you believe and how you hold those beliefs.
No, but by the way, even in this case, such a report can be helpful.
Of course.
Because if you take into account the configuration in which
That plane flew, these characteristics can be transferred to a normal plane with this adjustment taken into account. Well, on this note, we'll probably wrap up.
Yes, there's still a lot more to say. Maybe next time.
I would like to add this thought that you mentioned, yes, about the Tempest. This is not the only case, by the way, when specific data came from the community, from our gaming community, in the form of, well, real documentation, not assumptions, not personal, infinitely valuable opinions, but specifically a collection of documentation that indicated some inaccuracies. We definitely work with this collection, always cooperate and love to refine what we already have.
in the change history, for example, of the ton of great battles updates, you can track the fact that vast number of improvements, adjustments and additions have been made.
Yes, it doesn't always happen quickly and immediately, but
Eventually.
yes.
So if there is anything confirmed by data, please bring it to our attention. On this note, we will probably wrap up. Roman, thank you very much. We will have more to talk about.
Thank you.
Our friends, we would like to inform you that these dev briefs will now be released every 3 weeks instead of 2. This is because we have already begun preparing for the release in Korea, which has significantly increased the workload in both development and marketing. Our resources are unfortunately not unlimited, so we will now release videos every 3 weeks, but our episodes will not become any less interesting. Stay up to date with the news and follow us on our social media. Please subscribe, like, and stay connected. Goodbye, everyone.